That cold morning, no one expected an act of kindness to change everything. What started as another day on the road became a story the whole town tried to explain, and few had the courage to tell. Before we begin, subscribe and turn on the bell. Here, we show that behind the engines and the leather, there are still human hearts. The desert wind cut through the thin fabric of Jack Harlan's jacket as he pulled his old pickup into the gravel lot of the Last Chance Diner, just off Route 66. It was the kind of place where the neon sign flickered like a dying heartbeat, casting red glows on the rain-slicked asphalt. The truck's engine ticked softly as it cooled, a reluctant sigh after the long haul from Tucson. Jack glanced in the rear view at his daughter Ellie, bundled in the passenger seat, her small face pale against the threadbare blanket. 7 years old, with eyes too old for her age, she clutched a worn, stuffed bear, its fur matted from too many washes. They'd been on the move for weeks now, ever since the mill in Phoenix shut down and took Jack's job with it. Single dad, no family to lean on, just the two of them against the endless stretch of highway. His boots, cracked leather, soles worn thin from years of factory floors and side gigs, felt heavier than usual as he stepped out, the chill seeping through the holes. He helped Ellie down, her sneakers scuffing the dirt, and they walked toward the diner's door, the bell jingling like a faint warning. Inside, the air smelled of burnt coffee and grease, the kind that clung to your skin. A few locals hunched over the counter, their conversations low murmurs under the hum of a faulty fluorescent light. At a corner booth sat a group of riders from the Iron Hawks, their leather vests patched with faded symbols, a hawk in flight, wings spread wide. They weren't the loud, revving types you saw in movies. These men moved with a quiet weight, like the road had carved silence into their bones. The leader, a broad-shouldered man everyone called Bear, nursed a black coffee, his graying beard catching the light. Beside him, a younger rider fiddled with a chain necklace, eyes distant. They nodded at Jack as he passed, a subtle acknowledgement from one road-weary soul to another. Jack slid into a booth with Ellie, ordering pancakes and hot chocolate from the waitress, Maria, whose smile lines spoke of too many shifts and not enough rest. She was a single mom herself, scraping by in this nowhere town, her apron stained from spills that never quite washed out. "Rough night?" she asked, pouring Ellie's drink with a gentleness that made Jack's chest tighten. He nodded, forcing a half smile. "Just passing through. Engine trouble back in Kingman." Lies came easy these days, a shield against questions he couldn't answer. Ellie traced patterns in the condensation on her glass, her small fingers leaving foggy trails. "Daddy, when can we go home?" she whispered, voice barely rising above the diner's quiet drone. Jack reached across, squeezing her hand. Home was a ghost now, a cramped apartment, a wife's empty side of the bed, taken by cancer 2 years back. He'd sold everything to keep the lights on, even his good boots, trading them for a few months' rent. These ones, patched with duct tape, were all he had left. "Soon, kiddo, real soon." His voice cracked just a fraction, swallowed by the clink of silverware. The door swung open again, letting in a gust of cold that rattled the windows. In walked a man in a faded red jacket, the kind that might have once been part of a Santa suit from some holiday gig gone wrong. He was tall, weathered, with a white beard that hung unevenly and eyes shadowed under a wool cap. The locals called him Old Nick, a drifter who showed up every winter, peddling stories and small fixes for cash. He carried a sack over one shoulder, heavy with who knows what, and shuffled to the counter, boots thudding softly on the linoleum. Maria served him coffee, black as midnight, and he settled there, back to the room, listening more than speaking. The Iron Hawks glanced his way, but said nothing. Out here you didn't pry unless invited. Jack watched from the booth, Ellie's pancakes half-eaten, her appetite as thin as their wallet. He pulled out a few crumpled bills, counting them mentally, enough for the meal, maybe gas to the next town. The weight of it pressed on him, unspoken, like the rain pattering against the glass. Then it happened, quick as a shadow crossing the sun. One of the locals, a burly guy in a flannel shirt with grease under his nails, eyed Jack's feet as he stood to pay. The boots, split at the seams, laces frayed, drew snickers from him and his buddy at the counter. "Look at that," the first one muttered, loud enough to carry. "Single dad coming in here looking like he walked out of a ditch. What, you rob a hobo for those?" Laughter rippled, harsh and tinny, cutting through the warmth of the diner. Ellie shrank against Jack, her bear pressed to her chest, eyes wide with that quiet fear kids carry like a second skin. Jack froze, hand on his wallet, the heat rising in his throat. He wasn't one for fights, never had been, but the words landed like punches, stirring the old guilt, the nights he'd lain awake wondering if he was failing her. Maria shot the men a glare, but they just chuckled, turning back to their plates. The Iron Hawks shifted in their seats, Bear's jaw tightening, but they held, watching. Old Nick, still at the counter, paused mid-sip, his broad back going still. Jack paid quietly, guiding Ellie toward the door, her hand trembling in his. The laughter followed them like exhaust fumes, lingering in the air. Outside, the rain had picked up, drumming on the truck's roof as he buckled her in. He slid behind the wheel, staring at the dashboard, breath coming in strained pulls. One more town, he thought, one more chance. But deep down the road felt longer than ever, the desert wind whispering doubts he couldn't outrun. As the engine sputtered to life, Jack didn't see Old Nick step out behind them, sack slung over his shoulder, eyes fixed on the truck's taillights fading into the gray. Nor did he hear the low murmur from Bear to his riders, "That ain't right." The diner door swung shut, sealing the moment, but the air hummed with something unspoken, a thread of compassion pulling tight in the chill. The rain had eased to a fine mist by the time Jack eased the truck onto the cracked shoulder of the highway. The wipers, slapping rhythmically against the windshield like a metronome counting down to nothing. Ellie was asleep now, her head lolled against the window, the stuffed bear tucked under her chin, rising and falling with each shallow breath. The dashboard lights cast a faint green glow over her face, highlighting the shadows under her eyes, reminders of too many late nights in motels that smelled of mildew and regret. Jack kept the radio low, some old country tune about lost highways, the singer's voice gravelly and worn, mirroring the ache in his chest. He'd pushed the truck hard after leaving the diner, the engine groaning under the strain, but it held, just barely. The next town was a speck on the map, a place called Dust Hollow, barely more than a cluster of sun-bleached buildings hugging the interstate. Jack had passed through once before, years ago, when life still had some structure, before Sarah's illness turned their world upside down. Now, it felt like circling back to a half-forgotten dream, the kind that left you waking with a hollow pit in your gut. The neon sign for Harlan's garage flickered into view first, a beacon in the gathering dusk. It was the only mechanic shop for miles, run by a man named Thomas, who Jack remembered as a quiet type, hands calloused from wrenches and engines, eyes that saw more than he ever said. Jack pulled in, the gravel crunching under the tires, and killed the engine. The silence settled heavy, broken only by the distant rumble of thunder rolling over the desert. He sat there a moment, staring at the garage's open bay, where fluorescent lights buzzed over a half-disassembled motorcycle, its chrome glinting like exposed bone. Thomas emerged from the shadows, wiping his hands on a rag that was more oil than cloth. He was in his late 50s, stocky build softened by years, with a salt-and-pepper mustache that hid the faint scar on his upper lip, a remnant from some old accident he never talked about. "Harlan," he said, voice low and steady, like the hum of a well-tuned motor. Recognition flickered in his eyes, but no questions followed. Out here, folks learned early not to dig unless the ground gave way. "Evening, Thomas. Truck's acting up, knocking like it's got a grudge." Jack stepped out, boots scraping the concrete, the chill seeping through the thin soles. He glanced back at Ellie, still asleep, and Thomas nodded toward the office. "Let her rest. I'll take a look." Inside the office, the air was thick with the scent of motor oil and stale coffee from a pot that had been brewing since morning. Tools hung on pegboards like silent sentinels, and a calendar on the wall marked the days with grease smudges instead of ink. Thomas poured 2 mugs from the pot, the liquid dark and bitter, handing one to Jack without a word. They stood by the window, watching the mist swirl under the sodium lights, the highway stretching empty in both directions. "Been a while," Thomas said finally, his gaze fixed on the truck outside. "Heard about the mill closing. Tough break." Jack sipped the coffee, scalding his tongue, but he welcomed the burn. It sharpened the edges of his thoughts. "Yeah, we're just drifting. Ellie's school starts back soon, but—" He trailed off, the words hanging like exhaust in the air. Thomas didn't push. Instead, he set his mug down, the ceramic clinking softly against the desk. "Got a cot in the back if you need it, no charge. Roads like these, they take more than they give." Gratitude tightened Jack's throat, but he swallowed it down. Pride was a thin thread these days, fraying at the ends. "Appreciate it. We'll manage." Outside, the first drops of renewed rain pattered on the roof, a steady rhythm that filled the quiet. Thomas moved to the truck then, popping the hood with a practiced motion, his flashlight beam cutting through the gloom like a lifeline. Jack watched from the doorway, arms crossed against the cold, the weight of the day settling into his bones. As Thomas worked, a pair of headlights swept into the lot, slow, deliberate. It was Maria from the diner, her old sedan rattling to a stop beside the truck. She stepped out, umbrella in hand, her waitress uniform swapped for a faded sweater that hung loose on her frame. In the passenger seat, a boy about Ellie's age peered out, his face illuminated briefly by the dash lights. Maria's son, Luca, 8 years old, with a mop of dark hair and eyes that carried the same quiet wariness as his mother's. "Jack?" Maria called, her voice carrying over the rain. She approached, shaking out the umbrella, water droplets scattering like tiny accusations. "Saw your truck from the road. Thomas radioed me. Said you might need a hand with Ellie." There was no pity in her tone, just the matter-of-fact compassion of someone who'd walked similar paths. Single mom, 2 jobs, a kid who asked why the lights flickered at home. Jack had overheard her story at the diner earlier, pieced together from fragments between orders. "She's out cold," Jack said, nodding toward the truck. "Didn't want to wake her." Maria smiled faintly, the lines around her eyes deepening. "Luca's got some books in the car. Comics, nothing fancy. Thought Ellie might like them while you wait." She turned back, coaxing her son out into the mist. Luca clutched a plastic bag, rain beading on his jacket, and handed it over without a word, his small hands steady despite the chill. Jack took it, feeling the damp paper crinkle under his fingers, and something shifted inside him. A flicker of warmth against the encroaching dark. Thomas straightened from under the hood, wiping sweat from his brow despite the cold. "Timing belt's shot. Can patch it for the night, but you'll need parts come morning. Got a buddy in town who owes me." He glanced at Maria, then back to Jack. "Stay put. No sense pushing her in this." The group fell into an easy rhythm then, the kind born of shared margins. Maria brewed fresh coffee in the office, the aroma cutting through the oil, while Luca and Ellie stirred awake, the 2 kids murmuring over the comics under the harsh light. Ellie's laughter came soft at first, tentative, like an engine catching after a stall, a sound Jack hadn't heard in weeks. He stood apart, leaning against the doorframe, watching the scene unfold. Thomas tinkering with a loose wire, Maria folding a blanket over the kids, the rain drumming a lullaby on the tin roof. But the peace was fragile, threaded with unspoken strains. Jack caught Maria's eye as she passed, her expression tightening just a fraction. Those guys at the diner, the ones who laughed, they're locals, work the oil rigs, mouths bigger than their hearts. She paused, folding her arms, the sweater bunching at her elbows. Doesn't make it right. Jack nodded, the memory of the Snickers resurfacing like bile. His boots, still caked with diner gravel, felt like anchors now, pinning him to the ground. We've heard worse, keeps us moving. But his voice lacked conviction, the words dissolving into the hum of the garage fan. Thomas called from the bay, his tone even. She's purring again, for now. He closed the hood with a solid thunk, the sound echoing like a promise kept. As Maria gathered Luca, promising to check in tomorrow, Jack helped Ellie back into the truck, her small hand warm in his. The mist had thickened into fog, blurring the edges of the world. But for the first time that day, the road ahead didn't seem quite so endless. They pulled out slowly, taillights cutting red swaths through the haze, leaving the garage's glow behind. Jack didn't notice the silhouettes in the shadows near the highway overpass, 3 figures on motorcycles, engines idling low, their vests catching the faint light. Bear led them, his face set in quiet resolve, the Ironhawks trailing like guardians in the night. The desert wind carried whispers of what was to come, but in that moment, the only sound was the steady roll of tires on wet asphalt, carrying a father and daughter toward whatever dawn might bring. The fog clung to the edges of Dust Hollow like a shroud, muting the first light of dawn as Jack guided the truck through the narrow streets. Ellie stirred beside him, rubbing sleep from her eyes with the back of her hand, the stuffed bear wedged between her knees. The engine hummed unevenly, a faint rattle underscoring Thomas's patch job, but it carried them forward, past weathered clapboard houses where porch lights still glowed against the grey. The town was waking slowly, a milk truck rumbling down Main, its headlights slicing through the mist, a lone dog barking from behind a chain-link fence, its voice echoing hollow off the empty storefronts. Jack pulled into the lot of the Dust Hollow Community Clinic, a squat brick building with peeling paint and a sign that creaked in the breeze. It wasn't much, a few exam rooms, a waiting area with plastic chairs scarred by years of fidgeting patients, but it was the only place for miles that offered free checkups for folks without insurance. Ellie's cough had worsened overnight, a dry rasp that pulled at Jack's gut like barbed wire. He'd promised her pancakes for breakfast, but priorities shifted in the chill of pre-dawn, the kind of choices no father wanted to make. Inside, the air was sterile, laced with the sharp tang of antiseptic that burned the nostrils. The receptionist, an older woman named Clara, with silver-streaked hair pinned back severely, glanced up from her ledger. Her eyes, framed by wire-rimmed glasses, softened just a touch when she saw Ellie clutching Jack's sleeve. "First time here?" she asked, her voice carrying the faint drawl of someone born to these flats. Jack nodded, filling out the forms with a pen that scratched unevenly across the paper. Name, no insurance, transient. The words felt like admissions, each one etching deeper into the quiet shame he carried. They waited in the lobby, the clock on the wall ticking with deliberate slowness, its hands crawling past faded posters about flu shots and diabetes. Ellie swung her legs, sneakers tapping the linoleum, while Jack stared at the floor, tracing the scuff marks left by countless boots like his own. A few other patients filtered in. An elderly man with a bandaged hand, muttering about a fall from his porch. A young woman, heavily pregnant, her face drawn with exhaustion as she rubbed her belly absent-mindedly. No one spoke much. The clinic was a confessional of sorts, where stories hung unspoken in the air. Dr. Elena Vasquez emerged from the back, her white coat hanging loose over scrubs that had seen better days. She was in her 40s, with dark hair pulled into a practical bun and hands steady from years of stitching wounds, both seen and unseen. "Ellie Harlan," she called, her tone gentle but efficient. Jack followed his daughter into the exam room, the door clicking shut behind them like a seal on their vulnerabilities. The room smelled of rubber gloves and old magazines. The examination table covered in crinkling paper that Ellie perched on, her small frame swallowed by the space. Elena listened to Ellie's chest with a stethoscope, the cold metal drawing a shiver from the girl. "Breathe in for me, sweetheart," she said, her voice a low murmur. Jack stood by the sink, arms crossed tight, watching the doctor's brow furrow slightly. The rain from the night before had left puddles outside the window, reflecting the overcast sky in rippled distortions. "Bronchitis, likely from the cold," Elena concluded, scribbling a prescription. "Nothing serious, but she needs rest and antibiotics. I can get you samples. No charge." Jack's shoulders eased a fraction, the knot in his chest loosening like a rusted bolt giving way. "Thank you. We've been on the road a lot." Elena met his gaze, her eyes holding a quiet understanding, the kind forged from treating drifters and locals alike. She was a transplant herself, from the city, drawn here by a husband long gone and a commitment to the overlooked. "I know the type," she said softly, handing him the vial. "Take care of her, and yourself. Dust Hollow's got its rough edges, but folks look out when they can." Back in the waiting area, Clara slid a paper bag across the counter, crackers and juice for Ellie, compliments of the clinic's small pantry. "Sugar keeps the little ones going," she said, her smile brief but warm. Jack murmured thanks, pocketing the bag, the simple gesture landing heavier than it should. Outside, the mist had burned off, revealing the town's skeletal frame, a boarded-up theatre, its marquee faded to ghosts of old westerns, the oil rig workers' trucks lined up at the edge of town, engines idling like impatient beasts. As they stepped into the parking lot, the growl of motorcycles cut through the morning hush, low, throaty, approaching from the highway. The Iron Hawks pulled in, 3 bikes forming a loose arc near the clinic steps. Bear dismounted first, his boots thudding solid on the pavement, the leather vest creaking faintly as he stretched. The others, Rico, wiry with tattoos snaking up his arms, and Silas, broad and silent, followed suit, helmets tucked under their elbows. They weren't here for fanfare. The bike settled with a final sigh, chrome dulled by road dust. Bear's eyes found Jack immediately, a nod passing between them like an old pact renewed. "Heard about the girl," he said, voice gravel rough from years of wind and smoke. No details, no how. Word travelled fast in places like this, through radio chatter and diner whispers. Jack tensed, hand on Ellie's shoulder, the societal reflex kicking in. Bikers as trouble, shadows to steer clear of. But Bear knelt to Ellie's level, pulling a small candy from his pocket, wrapped in faded foil, the kind from a gas station roll. "For the cough," he offered, his large hand steady, palm up. Ellie hesitated, glancing at Jack, then took it with a shy whisper of thanks. The clinic door opened then, patients pausing in their tracks, Clara peering through the blinds, the pregnant woman averting her eyes. Whispers stirred, those hawks again, up to no good. Judgment hung thick, painting the riders as outlaws in leather, hearts as hard as their machines. But Rico crouched by Ellie's side, showing her a patch on his vest, a hawk with a shield beneath, symbol of something deeper than speed. "Keeps us safe on the road," he said quietly, his voice carrying a tremor of old wounds, perhaps from the sands overseas, where he'd lost brothers not bound by blood. Silas lingered by the bikes, scanning the lot with eyes that missed nothing, while Bear straightened, addressing Jack directly. "Town's got eyes. Those rig hands from the diner, they talk big, but we see through it." There was no threat in his words, just the measured calm of men who'd chosen loyalty over judgment. Jack felt the shift, subtle as a gear change. The bikers weren't intruders. They were the unseen net, woven from shared roads and silent oaths. Eleanor stepped out, locking eyes with Bear, a flicker of recognition passing. She'd patched him up once, after a spill on black ice, no questions about the vest or the scars. "Everything all right?" she asked the group, her tone neutral, bridging the divide. Bear nodded, the group mounting up as the sun broke through, casting long shadows across the asphalt. Engines roared to life, a chorus that vibrated through the ground, then faded into the distance, leaving only the scent of exhaust and a lingering warmth. Jack buckled Ellie in, the candy wrapper crinkling in her fist, her cough quieter now. The encounter replayed in his mind, the judgment from the sidelong glances, the humanity in the candy, and the nod. As they pulled away, the clinic shrinking in the rear view, the desert wind picked up, carrying the faint echo of throttles, a reminder that out here protection came not from badges, but from those willing to stand in the mist. Comment where you're watching from. I want to know how far these stories of courage and loyalty can travel. The sun climbed higher over Dust Hollow, burning off the last wisps of fog and turning the asphalt into a shimmering haze that distorted the horizon. Jack kept the truck's speed steady, the engine's rattle a constant companion now, like a labored breath he couldn't ignore. Ellie sat beside him, unwrapping the candy Bear had given her, the foil crinkling softly in the quiet cab. She popped it into her mouth, her cheeks hollowing with the first real sweetness she'd tasted in days, and for a moment the lines of worry eased from her face. Jack glanced over, his hand tightening on the wheel, the leather of his jacket creaking faintly against the seat. The clinic's kindness lingered in his mind, the samples from Dr. Vasquez, Clara's crackers, but it was the Iron Hawk's quiet gesture that tugged at him, a thread of unexpected warmth in the cold weave of the morning. They were headed to the edge of town, where the highway split toward the next speck of civilization, a place called Red Mesa with promises of odd jobs and cheaper motels. But first, Jack needed gas. The gauge hovered just above empty, a red warning that gnawed at his resolve. The station was a relic, pumps rusted at the edges, the canopy sagging under years of desert sun. A single bell dinged as he pulled up, the sound sharp against the wind that whipped sand across the lot. Ellie stayed in the truck, flipping through the comics Luca had shared, her cough subdued for now, a fragile truce. Jack fed the nozzle into the tank, the click of the pump echoing his pulse, steady but edged with strain. The fuel flowed slow, dollars ticking up on the display like accusations. He leaned against the truck, boots planted in the grit, and scanned the empty stretch of road. A semi thundered past, kicking up dust that stung his eyes, but otherwise the world felt suspended, the air thick with the scent of gasoline and sun-baked earth. That's when the pickup rolled in. The same flannel-shirted rig hand from the diner, his buddy riding shotgun, both nursing hangovers in the harsh light. They pulled up to the adjacent pump, engines cutting with a growl, and spilled out laughing, voices carrying like gravel under tires. The first one, broad with a gut straining his shirt, spotted Jack immediately, his eyes narrowing on the broken boot still dusted from the clinic lot. "Well, look who's limping along," he called, loud enough to bounce off the station's walls. His friend snorted, grabbing the nozzle with a smirk. "Bet those boots walked him right out of his last paycheck. Single dad special. Kids gotta eat, right?" The words landed heavy, stirring the embers Jack had buried since the diner. He kept his gaze on the pump, jaw set, the fuel's glug-glug a rhythm to match his rising pulse. But Ellie shifted in the cab, her small face pressing to the window, eyes wide as the men approached, their shadows stretching long across the concrete. "Daddy," she whispered through the glass, voice thin, the comic forgotten in her lap. The rig hand leaned in closer, peering into the truck with a leer that twisted his features. "Cute kid. Hope she's not catching whatever poverty bug you got?" Laughter erupted again, raw and unchecked, the second man clapping his partner on the back. Jack straightened, hand dropping the nozzle with a clatter, fuel spilling in a dark puddle that reflected the sky. His breath came strained, fists clenching at his sides, the old instinct to shield warring with the exhaustion that pinned him down. He wasn't built for this, not anymore, not with Ellie watching, her hands twisting the bear's ear. Before he could move, a low rumble built from the highway, growing into the unmistakable thunder of engines. The Ironhawks crested the rise, bikes slicing through the heat waves like blades, Bear in the lead, Rico and Silas flanking tight. They didn't rev or showboat. The machines purred to a halt in a loose formation, blocking the lot's exit, dust settling around their tires. Bear dismounted first, his presence filling the space without a word, the vest's patches catching the sun like warnings etched in leather. The rig hands faltered, laughter dying to uneasy chuckles. "What the biker trash?" the first one muttered, but his stance shifted, shoulders hunching. Bear ignored him, striding straight to Jack, his eyes flicking to Ellie in the truck, then back. He placed a hand on Jack's shoulder, firm but not forceful, the touch grounding like an anchor in rough seas. "Gas on us," Bear said quietly, pulling a worn wallet from his inner pocket. No explanation, no fanfare, just the slide of bills across the pump's counter to the attendant inside, who nodded without looking up. The rig hand stepped forward, bravado cracking. "Hey, this ain't your business. We're just joking." But Rico was there now, leaning against his bike with arms crossed, his gaze steady, unblinking, the kind that spoke of roads traveled and lines not crossed. Silas stayed mounted, engine idling low, a vibration that hummed through the ground. The air thickened, charged with the unspoken code that bound them. No one hurts those we protect. It wasn't rage in their eyes, but a quiet resolve, the compassion of men who'd seen enough broken things to know when to mend. Jack exhaled, the tension bleeding from his frame as he wiped his hands on his jeans, the gasoline scent sharp in his nostrils. Ellie's face relaxed against the glass, a small nod of trust forming. The rig hands backed off, muttering curses as they fueled up quick, tires spinning gravel when they peeled out, leaving skid marks like retreating scars. Bear watched them go, then turned to Jack, his voice low over the wind. "Roads full of fools, but we ride for the ones who matter." He glanced at Ellie again, a faint smile cracking his beard. "Get her some real breakfast. Dine her in Red Mesa. Tell 'em the Hawks sent you." The group mounted up, engines firing in unison, a symphony that drowned the desert's hush. They nodded farewell, bikes banking toward the horizon, exhaust trailing like whispered promises. Jack stood there a moment longer, the sun warming his back, the puddle of fuel evaporating under its gaze. He climbed into the truck, Ellie's hand finding his across the console, small fingers interlacing with a squeeze that said more than words. The tank was full now, not just with gas, but with something deeper, a shift in the weight he carried. The road ahead feeling a fraction less solitary. As they pulled onto the highway, the wind rushed through the open window, carrying the faint echo of throttles fading into the distance. Jack didn't look back, but the moment etched itself in, a small act blooming into the kind of loyalty that outlasted the miles. The highway unspooled like a faded ribbon under the relentless afternoon sun, the truck's tires humming a monotonous dirge against the cracked pavement. Jack kept his eyes on the road, the horizon blurring into a heat-shimmered mirage that promised nothing but more of the same. Ellie's breathing had steadied beside him, the candy's sweetness long faded, replaced by the quiet rhythm of her flipping pages in the comic book. The pages whispered as she turned them, a soft counterpoint to the engine's persistent rattle. But Jack's mind wandered elsewhere, replaying the gas station standoff like a loop of film stuck in the projector. The Ironhawks' intervention hung in the air between them, unspoken gratitude mixing with a fresh undercurrent of unease. Who were they, really? Shadows on the edge of town, offering aid without strings, yet stirring the old wariness that came from too many miles alone. Red Mesa emerged gradually, a cluster of low-slung buildings baked to the color of rust. The diner bear had mentioned squatting at the crossroads like a weary sentinel. Its sign buzzed faintly as they pulled in, the parking lot half empty, save for a couple of semis idling like dozing giants. Jack cut the engine, the sudden silence amplifying the desert's breath, the wind sighing through scrub brush, carrying the faint tang of sage and exhaust. He helped Ellie out, her sneakers kicking up small puffs of dust, and they stepped inside, the door's bell tinkling like a hesitant invitation. The place smelled of frying onions and strong tea, the counter lined with stools worn smooth by countless transients. A waitress, with tired eyes and a name tag reading B, nodded from behind the register, her movements efficient, honed by years of feeding the road's castaways. "Two, please," Jack said, voice low, sliding into a booth near the window. Ellie climbed in opposite him, propping the comic on the table, her fingers tracing the inked lines of heroes in capes. B poured water without asking, the glasses sweating immediately in the dry heat, and left menus that Jack barely glanced at. The prices were kind, nothing fancy, just plates of eggs and biscuits that could stretch $1. He ordered light, the words sticking slightly in his throat, the memory of Bear's gesture making him hesitate over the check. "Hawks sent us," he added finally, testing the phrase like a key in an unfamiliar lock. Bee's eyebrow lifted just a fraction, but she nodded, jotting it down without comment, her pen scratching the pad like a secret being etched. As they waited, the door swung open again, admitting a gust of hot air and the figure of Old Nick. He shuffled in, the faded red jacket hanging loose on his frame, the sack over his shoulder thumping softly against his hip. His white beard caught the light filtering through the blinds, casting erratic shadows on the checkered floor. The diner folk glanced his way, B with a familiar nod, a trucker at the counter with a grunt, but no one stared. Old Nick was a fixture here, same as the flickering neon, appearing like clockwork in the lean months, trading odd jobs for meals or a corner to crash. He settled at the far end of the counter, ordering coffee with a murmur, his voice a gravelly rumble that blended into the sizzle from the grill. Jack watched him sidelong, the man's presence stirring something uneasy, like a half-remembered dream from childhood winters. Ellie noticed too, her eyes widening over the comic's edge. "He looks like Santa," she whispered, the words slipping out with a child's unfiltered wonder, her small hand pausing mid-page. Jack forced a smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. The weight of their situation pressing down, the broken boots under the table, the thin wallet in his pocket, the cough that might return with the evening chill. "Just a traveler, kiddo," he replied softly, but his gaze lingered on Old Nick's hands, calloused and steady as they cradled the mug, steam rising in lazy curls. The food arrived then, plates steaming, the biscuits flaking warm under Ellie's tentative fork. They ate in companionable quiet, the diner's hum wrapping around them like a worn blanket. But the peace fractured when the rig hand's pickup rumbled into the lot outside, tires crunching gravel with deliberate crunch. Jack's fork paused halfway to his mouth, the metal cool against his skin as the two men swaggered in, voices booming to fill the space. They claimed stools at the counter, close enough that their laughter grated like sand in gears. "That biker crew thinks they're kings of the road," the first one said, loud for the room, his flannel sleeve brushing Old Nick's arm without apology. "Paying for some bums gas? What's next? Adopting strays?" His buddy chuckled, ordering burgers with a slap on the counter, eyes scanning the booths until they locked on Jack. Recognition flared, and the smirk widened. "Speak of the devil! Hey, boot boy, enjoy the free ride? Hope your little one's not learning bad habits from those grease monkeys." The words sliced through the diner, drawing Bee's sharp glance and a hush from the other patrons. Ellie's hand froze on her biscuit, crumbs scattering like fragile defenses, her breath catching in a small hitch. Jack's pulse thrummed in his temples. the heat rising not from the sun, but from the coil of restrained fury low in his gut. He set his fork down deliberately, the clink echoing, his broken boots shifting under the table as if ready to stand. Old Nick didn't move at first, his back to the room, but the air shifted around him, the steam from his coffee seeming to thicken. The rig hand leaned past him, gesturing crudely toward Jack's booth. "What, cat got your tongue? Or just too broke to talk back?" The taunt hung, pulling the diner's gaze like a magnet, judgment flickering in the sidelong looks. Locals weighing sides, the unspoken divide between the respectable and the ragged. Jack rose slowly, chair scraping back, his hand reaching for Ellie's instinctively. The tension coiled tighter, a moral precipice yawning before him. Walk away, preserve the fragile calm, or push back and risk the storm. His breath came measured, strained through clenched teeth, the scent of grease and coffee turning sour in his nostrils. Ellie looked up, eyes pleading silently, her small frame tensing against the booth's vinyl. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows like a warning, the desert's vast emptiness pressing in. Then Old Nick turned, his stool creaking under the shift, the sack at his feet rustling faintly. His eyes, shadowed under the wool cap, met the rig hands with a steady calm that cut through the bluster. The diner fell silent, breaths held, the moment stretching like taffy pulled taut. "Those boots carried more than you know," Old Nick said, his voice low and even, 5 words dropping like stones into still water. The rig hand blinked, mouth opening on a retort that died unspoken, the weight of the gaze pinning him. Jack froze, the phrase echoing in his chest, reframing the laughter, the judgments, into something deeper, a quiet defense from an unlikely corner. The man backed off a step, muttering under his breath, his buddy tugging at his sleeve as they shoveled food hastily, the bravado deflating like a punctured tire. Bea cleared her throat, breaking the spell, and the diner resumed its rhythm, forks clinking, conversations murmuring back to life. Jack sank into the booth, heart pounding a fading tattoo, Ellie's hand finding his under the table, warm and anchoring. Old Nick turned back to his coffee, as if nothing had passed, but the air hummed with the residue of it, the small act rippling outward, stirring the compassion that bound strangers in the margins. As the rig hands paid and left, tires spinning out with less force than before, Jack met Old Nick's eye across the room. A nod passed, subtle as a shadow, carrying the promise of stories yet untold. The sun dipped lower, casting long rays through the blinds, gilding the edges of plates and worn boots alike. Ellie squeezed his hand tighter, her whisper barely audible. "He helped us, Daddy." Jack nodded, the road ahead feeling altered, the weight of unspoken loyalties lightening just enough to breathe. The diner's windows framed the fading light like a sepia photograph, the sun's last rays stretching shadows across the checkered floor until they tangled with the legs of empty stools. Jack sat motionless in the booth, his fork abandoned beside the half-eaten plate, the cooling eggs congealing into a reminder of interrupted peace. Ellie's hand remained clasped in his under the table, her palm damp with the residue of nerves, her thumb tracing absent circles on his knuckle, a small anchor in the swell of what had just unfolded. Old Nick had returned to his coffee, the steam long dissipated, his broad back a silent barrier against the room's resuming murmur. Bea moved behind the counter with deliberate slowness, wiping spills that weren't there, her eyes flicking toward Jack with a mix of concern and quiet approval. The air still carried the echo of those 5 words, heavy as the scent of cooling grease, refracting the afternoon into something sharper, more defined. Jack exhaled slowly, the breath escaping in a measured pull that did little to ease the knot low in his chest. Gratitude warred with suspicion, the old reflex of self-reliance clashing against the unexpected shield Old Nick had thrown up. Who was this drifter, really? His faded red jacket, the uneven beard, hallmarks of a man who'd wandered too long, perhaps, but those eyes held depths Jack couldn't read, like wells dug in parched earth. Ellie leaned forward, her voice a tentative thread. "What did he mean, Daddy? About the boots?" She glanced at old Nick's profile, curiosity softening the fear that had creased her brow moments before. Jack squeezed her hand, searching for words that wouldn't unravel the fragile calm. "Means he sees more than most, kiddo. People like us. We carry stories in the wear and tear." Bea approached then, clearing plates with a soft clatter, her voice pitched low over the rim of her notepad. "That was something. Nick doesn't speak up often. Lets the wind do the talking for him." She paused, stacking the dishes, her apron strings brushing the table's edge. "You two leaving soon? Roads get tricky after dark round here." Jack nodded, pulling out the last of Bear's gifted bills, the paper crisp against his calloused fingers. The gesture from the Hawks lingered too, a web of kindnesses pulling tighter, but it stirred unease, debts unspoken, loyalties he hadn't asked for. Outside, the wind gusted, rattling the blinds like loose chains, carrying the faint whine of tires approaching from the highway. The rig hand's pickup slewed into the lot again, brakes squealing against the gravel, headlights stabbing the twilight like accusatory fingers. Jack's pulse quickened, a low thrum in his ears as the two men piled out, their steps heavier now, fueled by liquid courage from whatever dive they'd hit between stops. The first one, flannel rumpled and face flushed, yanked the diner door open with enough force to jangle the bell into discord. His buddy followed, eyes glassy, scanning the room until they fixed on the booth. "Thought we'd let it slide, boot boy?" The leader barked, voice slicing through the quiet, drawing Bea's sharp intake of breath and a hush from the lone trucker at the counter. "But that old coot sticking his nose in makes it personal." Old Nick didn't turn this time, his fingers tightening around the mug's handle, knuckles paling against the ceramic. Jack rose halfway from the seat, shielding Ellie with his body, her small form pressing close, breath shallow against his side. The moral ledge sharpened, swallow the bait and risk escalation, or hold steady and let the storm pass. His boots scraped the floor, soles catching on a worn seam, the duct tape pulling taut like a warning. "We're done here," Jack said evenly, voice strained but controlled, the words tasting of ash. "Walk away." But the rig hand advanced, closing the distance to the booth, his shadow falling over the table, reeking of stale beer and sweat-soaked resentment. The diner tensed, Bea's hand hovering near the phone behind the counter, the trucker shifting on his stool with a creak of wood. Ellie whimpered softly, her free hand clutching the comic's edge until the paper tore faintly. Jack's mind raced, visions of fists and fallout, the truck's fragile engine no match for a chase, Ellie caught in the crossfire of men too small to let slights die. The rig hand leaned in, breath hot and foul. "You and your ragtag saviors think you're untouchable. Bikers, hobos, whole town's a joke." His buddy hovered, cracking knuckles that popped like dry twigs, the threat coiling visible in the flex of his arms. Then the rumble started outside, deep, resonant, vibrating through the walls like an approaching quake. Motorcycles, multiple, engines throttling down to a predatory growl before cutting silent. The Iron Hawks burst through the door in a rush of leather and wind. Bear at the fore, his frame filling the threshold, Rico and Silas fanning out behind. No weapons drawn, no shouts, just presence, heavy and unyielding, the air thickening with the scent of exhaust clinging to their vests. Bear's eyes swept the scene, locking on the rig hand with a calm that chilled deeper than any glare. "Enough!" he said, the single word dropping like a gavel, low and final. The rig hand whirled, bravado fracturing into stuttered curses, but Silas stepped forward, broad shoulders blocking the exit, his silence more eloquent than any threat. Rico moved to Jack's side, a subtle barrier, while Bear addressed the intruders directly, voice steady over the diner's held breath. You've got mouths that run faster than sense, but this ends now. No more words, no more looks. The rig hand's face twisted, fists balling, but the weight of the room shifted. The Hawks weren't aggressors. They were the quiet enforcers of a code older than the law, compassion forged in the fire of shared roads. Bee exhaled audibly, the phone forgotten, as the tension peaked, a suspended moment where choices hung like dust motes in the dying light. Old Nick rose then, slow and deliberate, his stool scraping back with a resonant scrape that cut the standoff. He faced the rig hands fully, sack slung over his shoulder, the faded red jacket catching the neon's flicker from outside. "Those boots," he said again, voice gravel-worn but clear, eyes meeting Jack's over the fray, "carried a soldier home." The words landed like a revelation, reframing everything, the drifter's gaze softening with recognition, pulling at threads Jack had buried deep. Old Nick wasn't just a wanderer, he was a ghost from Jack's past, a fellow veteran from the sands of Iraq, the man who'd pulled him from a burning Humvee 12 years back, the debt unspoken until now. Jack's breath caught, memories flooding in fragments, dust-choked patrols, the crack of gunfire, a white-bearded sergeant who'd become legend in the haze of survival. The rig hands faltered, the fight draining from their postures as the truth rippled outward, humanizing the margins they'd mocked. Bear nodded faintly, the Hawks holding formation, their loyalty a silent vow extending to this unearthed bond. Ellie's eyes widened, piecing it together in her child's way, her hand squeezing Jack's tighter. The leader muttered an apology that rang hollow, backing toward the door with his buddy in tow, the pickup's engine roaring to life outside before tires bit gravel and fled into the dusk. The diner exhaled collectively, the hum resuming, Bee pouring fresh coffee, the trucker muttering approval under his breath. Old Nick met Jack's gaze, a nod passing laden with years, the revelation bridging the chasm of time and miles. "Roads circle back," he said softly, before shuffling out into the night, sack swaying like a pendulum. Jack sank into the booth, Ellie leaning against him, the weight of hidden pasts lifting just enough to reveal the compassion beneath. The Hawks lingered a moment longer, Bear's hand clapping Jack's shoulder in quiet solidarity, before mounting up and fading into the highway's embrace, engines whispering fade into the wind. If this story already has your heart, hit the like button. It helps the story of Jack Harlan reach more people who still believe in humanity. The neon sign of the Red Mesa Diner flickered into life as dusk settled over the town, its red glow pooling on the gravel lot like spilled blood from a shallow wound. Jack sat in the booth, the vinyl creaking faintly under his shifting weight, Ellie's head resting against his arm, her breathing soft and even now that the tension had ebbed. The air inside carried the lingering sharpness of confrontation. Stale beer from the rig hand's retreat, the earthy bite of Old Nick's departing shadow, and the faint, acrid trace of motorcycle exhaust seeping through the cracks in the door. Bee's hands moved methodically behind the counter, stacking mugs with deliberate clinks. Her gaze averted, but her posture eased, the diner's rhythm reclaiming its quiet pulse. Jack's fingers traced the edge of the table, the wood scarred from years of knives and elbows, each groove a testament to stories etched without words. The revelation from Old Nick hung in the air like dust motes caught in the fading light, refracting memories Jack had packed away in the recesses of his mind. Iraq, the endless sand that gritted between teeth, the roar of engines under fire, the Humvee's frame twisting in flames. Old Nick, then Sergeant Elias Kane, had hauled him out, white beard already streaked with soot, his grip iron-strong amid the chaos. "You walk home on those boots, Harlan," he'd growled back then, voice cutting through the din like a lifeline. 12 years later, those same boots, cracked, duct-taped, mocked, had carried him here to this crossroads diner, where the past circled back not with vengeance, but with a quiet reclamation. Ellie stirred, her small hand uncurling from his, fingers brushing the comic's torn page. Is he really Santa, Daddy? Or just like us? Her voice was a whisper, laced with the innocence that survived the day's fractures, her eyes reflecting the neon's pulse. Jack paused, breath catching in his throat, the weight of survival pressing like the desert's unseen hand. He's both, kiddo, seen more roads than most, carried more than he lets on. He didn't elaborate. Words felt inadequate against the subtle truths unfolding, the way old Nick's nod had bridged the gulf of lost years. Forgiveness unspoken in the tilt of his head. No grand speeches, just the shared silence of men who'd outlasted the unforgiving, finding redemption in the margins where society turned blind. Outside, the wind sighed through the scrub, carrying the distant hum of the Iron Hawk's engines as they melted into the highway's embrace. Bear's final clap on Jack's shoulder lingered like a brand, firm, reassuring, the touch of brotherhood forged not in blood, but in the code of the road. The Hawks weren't saviors in shining armor. They were the quiet guardians, their leather vests hiding hearts scarred by their own hidden pasts. Veterans like Silas, who'd lost a leg to an IED and found purpose in the throttle's growl. Rico, grieving a brother to the bottle, channeling rage into protection for the vulnerable. Society painted them as outlaws, engines drowning out any hint of humanity, but Jack saw now the layers peeled back. Compassion in the candy for Ellie, loyalty in the blockade at the gas station, justice meted not with fists but with presence, a wall against the world's casual cruelties. Bea slid a fresh mug of coffee across the table, black and steaming, her smile faint but genuine, lines etching deeper around her eyes. On the house, for sticking it out. She was another thread in this unexpected tapestry, a single mom like the shadows Jack glimpsed in his own reflection, scraping by on tips and grit, her own moral conflicts waged in the quiet hours after closing. Jack nodded thanks, the warmth seeping through the ceramic into his palms, chasing the chill that had settled in his bones. The rig hand's departure replayed in his mind, not with triumph, but a somber reflection on the fragility of pride, how their bluster crumbled under the light of truth, leaving room for forgiveness to breathe. They'd slunk away, tails tucked, perhaps nursing regrets in the cab of their truck, the desert night swallowing their echoes. As the diner emptied, the lone trucker tipping his hat on the way out, Jack gathered Ellie close, her warmth a balm against the encroaching dark. The road ahead stretched infinite, dotted with uncertainties, motel nights, job hunts, the cough that might linger. But for the first time in months, it didn't feel like fleeing. Survival wasn't just enduring the miles, it was these intersections, where outcasts wove a net of silent support, loyalty eclipsing the law's cold impartiality. Jack's boots, worn to the sole, grounded him now, symbols of endurance rather than shame, carrying the weight of second chances earned through shared glances and unspoken vows. They stepped into the cooling evening, the truck's door groaning open like an old confession. Ellie climbed in, buckling with a click that echoed finality, while Jack paused by the hood, staring at the stars pricking the velvet sky. The wind whispered through the lot, stirring gravel into soft eddies, a reminder that humanity persisted in the overlooked places, in the drifter's 5 words, the biker's rumble, the waitress's mug. He slid behind the wheel, engine turning over with a reluctant cough, headlights carving a path into the unknown. Ellie leaned her head against the window, the comic clutched like a talisman, and Jack pulled onto the highway, the neon diner's glow shrinking in the rear view. In the quiet that followed, the road became a confessional, where guilt dissolved into grace, and the heart's hidden rhythms beat on, unyielding as the desert dawn. Subscribe for more stories of compassion, justice, and redemption. Thank you for watching the case of They Laughed at the Single Dad's Broken Boots. Santa turned around and said 5 words that changed everything. See you in the next one. The desert wind carried their story onward. A whisper of boots that walked through fire and found home in the kindness of strangers.